Howard is the interim dean for the best seminary in America, Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union University, where I earned my Master's of Divinity and my Doctor of Ministry degree. I wouldn't trade it. And he's our interim dean. They just should remove interim. Just say dean. He's a brilliant brother. I love him. And he's come on to be a blessing to us. He's going to be talking about theology and preaching. So we're going to turn over now to Dr. Howard.
Again, good afternoon, sisters and brothers. Thank you, Dr. Guns. Thank you, John, for the invitation to share and certainly be among my peers and brilliant minds and proclaimers of the gospel in their own right. You may mention that Dr. Frank Thomas will be on next week, just as Dr. Kimberly Credit and others have preceded me today. I'm oftentimes reminded of Frank Thomas's words that he shared down in Dallas at the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference about 5 or 6 years ago. And he stated that one of our greatest, if not the greatest enemy that we face is that of privilege, because no one wants to give it up. And even preachers, from the rural to the urban, from small church to mega church context, there are certain privileges, I dare say, that one may have. And in particular is being realized right now during this time of stay-at-home orders and physical distancing, that we are privileged oftentimes to be that one voice in the valley that individuals are made to hear. And certainly our voices are being heard by way of live stream, Facebook Live and Zoom and all types of virtual platforms. But for many preachers, an empty church is an enemy. It's the loss of a particular privilege that sometimes we take for granted. I just thought of that in light of your reference to Thomas. And certainly he spoke of it more so from the socioeconomic standpoint. But I trust that I would never take for granted that grace gift that we have to be called to preach, and then in particular preach oftentimes Sunday to Sunday to a captive audience, to a community of faith that I believe, and which I'll be talking about shortly, I believe serves as the means in which God reveals, God speaks, God shapes even the vision for the local church and even the Basileia, the kingdom of God overall. So we're talking about preaching and theology. Am I just to go ahead and talk, or are you going to at some point do a little Q&A as well?
You go ahead and present, and then you can do Q&A at the end. Okay,
then. All right. Thanks, Doc. So what I want to do is I want to at least center our thoughts today by departing from some type of working definition of what preaching is, and who's the preacher, and then from there seek to provide illustration even in the midst of this this chat or this talk or this lecture that we're having on preaching or the theology and practice of preaching. Provide even a theology of preaching that shapes even my hermeneutic and therefore delivery in preaching, and even talk about how theology is felt, is experienced, as Richard Lishner states that preaching is the first and the last expression of theology. So talk about how even when we gesture, even when we utter word with the particularities of our own unique intonation and cadence, and even that natural crescendo that is associated with proclaiming the gospel, that in itself pronounces what we dare say God is saying through us when we preach, or the theology of preaching. I do have a few slides here that I will try to share, John. I will try to share these slides and move through them. I'm certainly not going to be making reference to them all. And if you see them, let me know. Or do we have them?
Yes, they're up.
They're up, okay. And I'm just going to talk just briefly from making such reference to some of them, or some of that which is presented. Just preaching and considering preaching as the naming of grace and disgrace. We have to always take into account what is preaching, because I dare say you can't do what you don't know what it is that you're claiming to do. And certainly historically, you can go back all the way to the days of Allen Lill, and you can move your way up toward the likes of Craddock and Cleo LaRue and Mary Tubbs Tisdale, or Lenora Tubbs Tisdale, and countless others about what preaching is. You know, we're even reminded that preaching is, in essence, in the spirit of Philip Brooks, truth being exposed or disclosed, presented through personality. But I dare say that preaching, after capturing many of those definitions, is both the naming of grace and disgrace, and it's done through the vernacular or the rhetoric, the images and the gestures of a particular people. And I'll back up and expound upon this for the purpose of memorializing God's salvific work in the past, invoking God's liberating movement now, and certainly moving the people towards the better. Now, when we say that it's the naming of grace and disgrace, preaching causes us to become captivated. Such preaching that is the naming of grace and disgrace is oftentimes facilitated by a dialectic that's similar to the dialectical method, or homiletic, I should say, that's facilitated by the dialectical method, or like the 4 pages of a sermon, where there's a creation of tension, or tension that exists in our lives meets the tension that even the pulpit creates with the hope to offer some type of resolve. So preaching is not just simply naming the grace and the glory of, yes, our existence in God and certainly through Christ, but it also juxtaposes it and creates an appetite or longing for that grace by naming unapologetically and not being in denial whatsoever of the disgrace or our so-called condition of existence. And we do so by way of making such utterance that's not necessarily always holy, especially if it's not scripturally based, but certainly in the preaching moment, we also take advantage of play. We take advantage of all type of familiar rhetoric or the vernacular of a particular unique community in order to make sure that we are presenting ourselves as someone who's in the trenches and is familiar with the experience and even the language, the tone, and the tenor of that community's, again, lived experience. So we deliver it by way of a vernacular rhetoric and certainly images, and illustrations, and even gestures of the embodiment that we know as preaching, where it oftentimes in itself professes of a conviction that the preacher has. And we're not talking about histrionics in the words of James Harris or buffoonery, but we're talking about the embodiment of a conviction, and one who's proclaiming that which he or she is convinced of is worth hearing. So it's like dancing with the text. It is expressing oneself as exhibit A through Z when it comes down to one who's been made ready to hear what also one is preaching. And speaking of just that, it is all done with the intentions to, on one hand, or certainly one, and that is to memorialize. It's amniotic. It's memorializing God's salvific work in the past. Like preaching can prove to be impactful and effective by reminding us oftentimes what God has already done, while in the same manner it invokes God's liberating movement now. It causes us to see how God is in our midst right now. That is ultimately like the naming of the grace. When you take into account the feeding of the 5,000 in the gospel account makes mention and reference how they were in a desolate place, a remote place, a barren place. But preaching that causes one to see this grace and how God's liberating movement is in the midst or among us, even in spite of all of those imposing forces and realities, is one that would dare name or identify how the text oftentimes, or the text reminds us that they were able to take a seat, or Jesus sat them down on grass. That in this barren and remote place, there was yet still evidence of life or growth, hydration, because there was vegetation. It is taken into account that the woman with the issue of blood, and seeing how, yes, in spite of this hemorrhage and losing day by day that which sustains life, the text makes it plain in liberating fashion that she was still one who dared to be out among and in relationship with at least one who she heard had the capacity to heal her. So therefore she dares to press. So it's not just about memorializing what the Lord has already done, but again, identifying how in the text and even in contextual experiences, there's evidence of God's movement. And then ultimately, preaching ought to move us toward the better. I heard some preachers today that by the grace of God made me better. I heard from God through preachers who named the grace and named the disgrace in such a manner, in a way that it appealed to my spirit, my interest, my better self. And likewise, preaching, listen, ain't easy. Therefore, I choose not to offer such a definition that would suggest that it is. This is a very comprehensive definition, because preaching is multi-layered, and it's and again, it's not easy. But the question is, what is a preacher? Certainly, is more than one who preaches. But I pulled some language from Gail Ramshaw and others, and I dare say that preaching, or the preacher, serves as a mediator of meaning, whose primary purpose is to interpret and put into words what one might very well ponder, but cannot necessarily manufacture vocally, verbally, or in words. In other words, teachers teach us what we don't know. Preachers teach us or put into words what we suspect, but we can't necessarily express. So the preacher is like a translator of divine truth in the folk talk. My dear mama and grandmama and a whole lot of others, they suspected what was happening and what was going on, but could not necessarily put their finger on it until Sunday came around, and the preacher dared to stand and make sense of our existence and our times and our reality, and served as resident theologian, if you will, at least for that day, and dared to name the grace, or name, in spite of the disgrace, the action or the movement of God. And I find it critical, again, early on right now, to at least have you to understand how I define and our definitions of preaching differ. But what drives me from day to day, Sunday to Sunday, in the pulpit and also behind the lectern as far as relates to teaching, preaching, is knowing or having such a working and operative definition of preaching and preacher. Preacher dares to make sense, again, of the wind that seemingly captures Peter's attention in his eye and causes him to lose not just simply focus, but balance. Preachers dare to provide meaning to this bush that is ablaze or on fire and even starts to talk, but is yet not consumed. A teacher is just going to tell you about the text, and certainly memory plays a major role in maturation and growing and developing in the faith in particular, because at least you know the story or you can recall the story. But the preacher is not just about being a storyteller, but one who, again, brings meaning to the story, narrates, yes, but also provides illustratively that which the story is trying to signal or suggest or share with us. So there lies definitions of at least preaching and preacher. So therefore, I want to offer an illustration as well. And for the sake of it, even as I'm talking or lecturing, I am intentionally delivering it not sermonically, but methodically, as preaching, as I will share in a moment, and preachers must take into account that we ourselves are not, at the end of the day, the primary intended audience. So just as we know that we are to become a walking thesaurus so that we can make sure that we are speaking to multiple audiences at the same time by using language that can reach as many within the masses as possible. Preaching as a whole, we're graced to preach. We're privileged to be called to preach. But and yes, we receive revelation and word to share with others, but that's it. It is intended to be shared with at least one other. I was talking to a good friend of ours, John, last evening, and we praying for our good brother, Dr. Martin, and others. Y'all know our good friend, Dr. Waller, whose mother transitioned a few days ago, and her homegoing celebration is going to be on Tuesday. But Dr. Waller and I, we were talking last evening about the Valley of Dry Bones text, and I was sharing as perhaps it's nothing new under the sun, but from a perspective that I once preached or proclaimed, that within that text, we're reminded of the voices in the valley. And initially, yes, there are two voices, you know, in essence, for the, you know, the voice of the prophet, and at least the hearing, and then ultimately the voice of the prophet, preacher, and then obviously, most importantly, the voice of God. But the proclaiming of what the prophet receives from the faithful proclamation of what the prophet has received from God is that which bears evidence of its intended audience, and that is the pew, of those of us, including the preacher, who still find ourselves existing or living in the midst of valley-like experiences. We start to make noise only when we have heard something that's worth hearing and life-altering, transforming, and changing. Those bones start to make noise after something, again, life-giving and life-altering and transformative was shared. So the intended audience at the end of the day is the 1, 2, 3, or 5 or 6,000 that we are privileged to preach to. So therefore, the illustration I offer that I hope will challenge us is this. And I see 1 or 2 former students on, and perhaps they can recall, I believe I've offered this illustration to them. that when it comes down to the theology of preaching, we're talking about the substance of what we say we are called to do and proclaim. We're talking about the evidence or the revelation of God in our words or through our finite existence and our oftentimes yet still obviously ill-equipped words. That the theology is in many ways like H2O, or I dare say it's the water. It's that which is life-sustaining. It is that which is essential and critical to our health and our well-being and our existence. All right. If that's the case, then we have to do a better job as preachers in prepping ourselves by having a host of, or at least an ace in our pocket in regards to a hermeneutic and a homiletic. That if we dare say to the core, this is what God will have us to say and what is being said through our service and our preaching ministry, then that hermeneutic that we take with us when we enter the text in our prep, and today is a day of prep. That hermeneutic is like the pulley or the pump or the trigger on the faucet that assist us or help us in retrieving that water that we believe is the water in itself is self-sustaining, but that water is also, again, essential for the continuation of the survival and the thriving of humanity, but certainly the people of faith. And therefore, if the water is the theology and the substance, and if the hermeneutic is whatever means we use in order to retrieve it. Like sometimes you have to pull out a shovel, you have to dig deep, if you will. But at some point, you're going to tap into that source. I'm from the country, and it's not too far removed from my memory when we would go to our grandmother's well, whom we live right beside, and we would eventually she had a pump, and eventually she had faucets in the house. But early on, there was still a well in which we would drop the rope and the bucket down into those chilly waters and pull that water from the depths of that well. Preaching requires us, in other words, to get our grit on. It requires us to oftentimes use different tools and means in order to extrapolate or get to the substance or the water that we desire to extend to those who are suffering from a generational thirst even. But the homiletic is, after you have retrieved the water, how are you, John, going to now deliver it? And here's the thing, that in delivering the message, in delivering the revelation, in delivering the water, context have to be taken into account as well, because I don't think any of us would want anyone to quench the thirst of our newborns or our kids with a full pail of water. Nor would I want to offer a thimbleful or capsize full drink of water to one who's been made to be engaged, it seems, in a marathon or a race or a constant sprint, his or her whole life. The homiletic is as such that you want to, as a preacher, no matter how substantive and solid your theology is, you want to make sure you deliver it unto the receiver. And here's how critical it is, no matter how, again, solid and sound and convinced you are of the substance of your preaching and the theology of your preaching. Delivery matters. If not, it's all for naught. If you ask me for a drink and I remove myself from your presence, and I go to the kitchen, or I go out in the yard, in the field, and I make my way back unto you who's thirsty with my hands cupped and say, here you go, here's your drink. more than likely, whatever water perhaps I was able initially to hold in my hand, I lost it while making my way back to the so-called proverbial pulpit or the pew where you were seated waiting for this substance or waiting for this water. And even if I was to make it back with residue of water, or if I was able to make it back with even a few droplets in my hand, I would imagine and I would trust that you will be careful, daring to drink from my hands, because my hands could very well be contaminated. And I say all of this because I'm talking about preparation. I'm talking about the need for us to be prayerful over and about the theology or the message or the nuts and the bolts and the essence of what we're delivering. If it's transformative, if it's about liberation, if it's grounded in any particular theology. We are daring to proclaim it, but we're also digging deep within the treasures of the scripture to ensure that we are appropriating the water. But then again, homiletic and prepping ourselves and engaging in dialogue one with another as far as preachers, and certainly study and being very intentional prior to standing on those nights, evenings, and Sunday mornings, that we are in essence not being found guilty of preaching with dirty hands. And I'm not a moralist. I'm not talking about morality here. I'm talking about the lack of preparation is dirty hands. And I note here the dirty hands are what causes some persons to even blame the water or choose other drinks to quench their thirst, when in reality is contaminated hands of the preacher or preachers who have not prepared even that which God has whispered unto them. My pastor, the Reverend Angelo Lee Chapman, who was also my advisor in undergraduate studies here at Virginia Union and now currently serves as the campus pastor here at Virginia Union and as a pastor of a church here in Richmond. He would say that as much as I say that preaching is dialogical, he explained or explicated his position of preaching, which caused me to say, well, yeah, it's trialogical. You know, he would suggest that the preacher who has his or her eye on the pew is made to step back with one's eye still on the pew and leaning back at the same time to hear from God and what God will have the preacher to say to the pew, while God's eye is both on the preacher and the pew. But the thing is that from hearing from God and returning back to the ambo, the lectern, and to proclaim what even God has shared with us, to share with the pew, requires the preacher to do his or her prepping to ensure that oftentimes that which is lofty, that which is of such revelation is still communicated and expressed in a tone, in a language, and through illustration that the masses, or the majority of the masses, will receive and appreciate and be edified through by hearing by way and through the preacher. So knowing what preaching is, knowing who the preacher is or ought to be, getting ourselves to a place whereby we are also seeking to fulfill, even by way of illustration, who we dare say we are and who we be. You know, theology, which informs and shapes even one's hermeneutic. In other words, you're looking for the water. And I trust that we are all preaching water, as opposed to Kool-Aid, you know, or sugar water even. Led me to be able to name and articulate after a number of years what I dare say God is doing in the midst of preaching and preaching the scripture. So theologically speaking, I classify this as recreated imagination. and I captured this in my work, Voices Crying Out in the Wilderness, Theological Reflections Where Context Matters. But recreated imagination for me is based upon Imago Dei tradition, or it's based upon Imago Dei type of preaching. It's transformational in that it's preaching that lends to the illustrations and the biblical witness that will bring us back at one with God and, yes, with one another, by showing how we are created in the image of God and how we can be recreated and how we are being recreated in the preaching moment. So therefore, from Genesis to Golgotha, or from the garden to Golgotha, from the Adam and Eve story and narrative to Jesus and the two thieves on the cross that are often now haven't just simply pondered or thought out loud, but even pinned it down, to dare suggest that perhaps those two thieves on the cross is really one person. It's a split self that's being reconciled or recreated in Jesus. And what that means, again, is that we see in Genesis, and again, being reconciled or recreated in Calvary, on Calvary, that there's, we are created in the image of God. So we have a concept or a perspective, or we are rational beings. There's a sense of rationality that God has created us to be able to think, to ponder, to consider, to weigh one thing over the other, as we see being played out in Genesis. And for the sake of time, I will not provide necessarily full illustration, but relationality as well. We are, as Karl Barth said, co-humanity. We've been created to be with and for one another, as we see not only in Adam and Eve, but we also see, as the text says, the Bible says, let us create them in our image. We also have a moral consciousness. And there's a misprint there, a typo there on the screen, and then we are co-creative, not co-equal, but co-creative. God has created us to advance the well-being of humanity, as to be destructive and threaten its existence. And then there's a sense of self-transcendence, that a drive towards the infinite. We can see outside of ourselves. We have imagination. We can hope forward. We can see ourselves elsewhere, or moving beyond our current state or our current posture and position. So my theology of preaching, therefore, as I would suggest, everyone needs to settle and be able to name or classify, identify what, again, one says that God is saying through one's preaching. It informs my hermeneutic. So when I look at, again, such a text as the woman with the issue of blood, as we alluded to earlier, the sister with the issue of blood, what God is also saying unto me is that this woman proves unto us how we can be recreated through Christ. That for her, when it comes down to relationality, that had been compromised, because according to Levitical law, of course, we're familiar with the fact that she was not even supposed to be out in the public square. And perhaps she was void of any type of intimate relationship due to this constant suffering that she had to endure in the form of this bleed. But yet she's made by Christ and compelled by the hearing of what folk were saying, because the text says that she heard that he was out there. So someone had been proclaiming. And then the sister makes her way, John, out toward Jesus. And later that pericope concludes with Jesus identifying her as well as daughter. So arguably that, well, not arguably, but I take the position oftentimes that one aspect to this text that God will have at least this preacher to proclaim based upon my operative theology of preaching is that God's word has a way of reuniting, reconnecting, or recreating us in the image of God. And one aspect of that is bringing us back in right relationship one with another. And more so, it was not her issue, but it was the community's issue. It was the dogma of the former religious elites issue. But Christ now shows Christ's self as one that brings one back into right relationship with self, with community, certainly with God. There's evidence of being self-transcendent in her. So each text that I preach, I see at least shadows and shades of one of these five aspects of the Imago Dei. And again, she said, if I would but touch the hem of his garment, I'll be made whole. So theology ought to, or what we dare say God is saying through our preaching, and I'm not talking about a mere proposition from Sunday to Sunday in your sermon prep. Certainly, of course, Isaac Rufus Clarke said, if you don't have a proposition, you don't have a sermon, or ain't got a sermon. So that sentential statement, that main point and premise of the scripture, yes, you need that, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what undergirds that, and therefore, what is that which you have to rest upon day after day after day after day, even when you don't know what to say. One of the most profound things I heard as well was the words shared by Timothy Ratcliffe, who is a Black friar within the order of preachers, said that he was approached while he was actually struggling to prep himself for Sunday's homily, approached by someone in community, a fellow priest, that someone wanted to see him. And the whole time, days in and days out, he had no idea what to say in light of some things that had occurred and happened in that unique community. But he dared to get up eventually and interrupt his sermon prep that was headed nowhere, because he found himself in a place of utter silence. And what happened is that he engaged in this conversation with this person, and it's through that person he received such revelation that led to what he calls the happening of grace. So I'm saying that you know, there are moments and there are seasons and times when we are in this sort of state of intertestamental silence ourselves as preachers. But I dare say, if to the core, you have a foundation that is of your theology of preaching, that again, that informs and shapes even your lens or your hermeneutic into the text, and you can have more than one, you know, then it'll make prepping and therefore preaching not as burdensome from day to day. But if you don't know where to start off from, you know, if there's no point of reference or no point of departure, then likewise we might find ourselves all over the place, meandering from day to day. But if you have a theology of liberation, if process theology shapes and drives, or womanism shapes and drives your view and your to preaching, what God is saying through your preaching, then hey, settle upon it. But also, it can be used to help you identify whether or not you're being made to use a pulley or pump, you know, or faucet, in order to retrieve that water from the text and therefore proclaim it and offer it substantively by way of a homiletic or a cup. So in delivering, lastly, the theology as a preacher who's daring to name the grace and the disgrace, you know, we can say that yes, one's preaching is evangelical, one's is doctrinal, one's pastoral, one's prophetic, or in many ways, preaching shows itself as one, if not a few of those each time we proclaim, that we have to deliver it with what I said earlier, with great conviction. We have to be convinced, listen, that is worth hearing, even if you have yet to get to a place where you yourself or we ourselves have fully put our trust in it. But it's worth hearing. Not me as preacher worth hearing, but what I've toiled with, what I've wrestled with, what I've heard God say needs to be said. That moment that takes place over there on the other side of Yabak River, as Jacob wrestled with the angelos, or the angel, or the messenger of God. That which you hear on that side of the river is, you're convinced, is worth being heard now that you're on the other side come Sunday morning. That which you even heard Jesus say prior to Friday, and even on Friday, you're convinced, even if you have yet to test it fully yourself, you're convinced in your delivery, and so much so that preaching a religious rhetoric, as Cicero and later on St. Augustine stated, is intended to instruct, delight, and persuade. But you're so convinced that you can persuade others that it's worth hearing. And then inductively, in many ways, they'll make up their mind whether or not they want to trust it too, or trust it or not. But it's worth hearing. You can use parable, you can use illustration. I dare say I find myself sometimes between the debate or the argument that took place between Thomas Trojer and Robert Dykstra, or whether or not we ought to preach ourselves or tell our stories or not. And Trojer talks about employing personal parabolic statements, if anything. In other words, you use your story, but be creative and tell your story by recreating yourself, mask yourself, dare say that you heard someone say, but you're still able to therefore illustrate and preach and proclaim it with conviction that's persuasive and convincing, as opposed to saying constantly what I have been through. And therefore the pew is oftentimes either moved to pity for the preacher, or moved to leave the presence of the preacher because they're tired of the preacher talking about him or herself. So the delivery matter. And as Black preachers primarily, or many of us who are Black preachers, I don't know who is all online, Black preaching, or the substantive Black preaching, takes into account once again rhetorically all these theories and devices that are used, and that are repetition, and that of anaphora and epistrophe, and that of syncopated stammering and deliberate pause, that the likes of so many that we consider to be the deans of preaching mastered, that you are intentionally using in your delivery such rhetorical devices to ensure that the pew is being made to hear everything that you say, or everything that is at least worth being heard, and fostering memory as well in that which you are delivering. So I'm saying that as far as preaching the gospel, it is again a preaching, or this call that we dare say we have accepted, is the naming of both grace and disgrace, again through the vernacular rhetoric, images, and gestures of a particular people. It's for the purpose of memorializing God's salvific work in the past, just celebrating, honoring, and telling the story on one hand what God has already done, in and through the text and through the lives of those who've gone on before us. It's about sharing it, memorializing God's salvific work, I should say, but then also invoking God's liberating movement. Having the ear to see what God is still doing. And likewise, with the ultimate intent to move the pew of the people toward whatever their defined better is. How shall they hear without a preacher? And how shall he or she preach unless he or she has been sent? When you talk about the anatomy of the preacher, only 3 body parts, you have to have at least one ear. You have to have a mouth. You have to hear what God will have you to say, and you have to say it. And certainly we have feet, feet that meet the pew where they are, feet that preaches in the valley and in the midst of the valley, in the midst of the trenches, that also solidifies and affirms unto the pew, not just simply, yes, their value, but also the value of what you are daring to suggest they ought to hear, because you have chosen to be with us as we see Emmanuel, God with us. You have chosen to share this and proclaim this, not from the banisters of pure godliness or pure Godhead, but you have chosen to be among us. And therefore, what you're saying is reflective of our experience. And you have taken into account our experience, even in your study and even in your prepping. So all of this theology of preaching that I'm talking about in preaching is intended to make us all better, as opposed to make any one preacher popular. And then certainly the preacher is that mediator of meaning, that you just by the grace of God, position in a place and equipped as well. And you don't have to be the greatest, most eloquent orator, but you are equipped to just make sense of these times. And in these Trumpian times, we need a preacher. In these COVID-19 times, we need a preacher. Shucks, mama and grandma and everyone else and papa, they see what's going on and they have ideas, or they suspect some things, but they can't say it the way that the preacher has been called to say it. You know, I recall, as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Kimberly Credit, I know you're on, when you were with us back at Ellison Jones Convocation this past year in 2019, you talked about that as well. You lend your voice as far as relates to being a personal witness, which was deeply moving and convicting. Again, this has nothing to do with having superior eloquence. You know what I mean? This is about just naming it, because you still been equipped to say it when others see it, but just cannot fashion it, you know, in words. And then again, once you establish your theology, which informs your hermeneutic, it will lead to one prepping his or herself much better than what we have done before. Thusly, or therefore, we won't be guilty of making our way to the pulpit with dirty hands. And again, I'm not saying that from a moralist standpoint at all. But what I'm saying is, again, by way of the illustration of the theology of preaching, or the substance of preaching being the water, and how you retrieve it as the hermeneutic, and the homiletic is the cup, or the cup, the way you deliver it, and all that you take into account as far as in delivering the water unto the one who desires to quench his or her thirst, or needs to quench his or her thirst. That you're doing so not barehanded, or in any ways ill-prepared, because in doing so, it gives the water a bad name. It gives the water a bad taste, when in reality it's due in part because we didn't present the water in the right container or cup. So I don't know if I'm pushing it now to that hour, but I can pause there, or I will pause there, John, and entertain and take any questions or offer any clarity, as I do appreciate the opportunity to share.
So I said if I wake her up, she'd probably beat me up.
I woke up at 5 minutes.
All right. Is there anyone with a question or questions? You can put it in the chat. You can type it, and Dr. Howard can read it, or you can share it. First of all, and let me just be very, very transparent. I have, with great intentionality, looked at who should do this season, who should be the voices a part of this season. And I'm gonna be very transparent. We're not trying to KFI, to Sons of Daughters St. Paul, to stamp and approve popular platform preachers. We're trying to give you the kind of substantive presentations that will stretch you, make you get off the Zoom and go look words up. We'll make you get off the Zoom and call your other preaching friends and say, have you ever thought about it like that? And begin to offer yourself in a way that allows you to grow. Dr. Howard is one of the most significant thinkers in seminary education today. And the fact that he is here with us and for us is amazing. So if you have a question, please, you can place it in the chat. If not, I need to remind everybody, Ray or Napoleon, can y'all put up his Cash App again? I want us to bless him. I've already sent mine, and well, my wife and I have already sent ours. So I want us to be a blessing to him at GM Howard, $GM Howard. And right now, send something, $10, $5, $50, $100, don't matter. Whatever it is, if you don't have it, that is not a prerequisite for being on. The prerequisite for being on is that you're going to work at preaching. You're going to put the work in, the effort in. You're going to advance the cause of preaching. So again, thank you. So again, $GM Howard. Again, no one is asking for anything, but we feel compelled to at least offer this. This hour is priceless. And those of us who've been a part of the seminary community, any seminary community, know that preaching classes were always refreshing for those of us. It was refreshing for me to hear Dr. Miles Jones change my life. And so hearing this presentation today took me back. So thank you. Thank you, Ray. Are there any questions or comments? Any questions or comments? Any questions or comments? If anybody.
Hey, John,
Yes.
while we might be entertaining that, again, thank you so much. This has been rich for me. And I will say this, even right now, let's be mindful that for most of us, or the majority of us, we're being made to preach, if you will, directly to empty pews, and also more and more being made to preach truly out loud by way of live stream and Facebook Live. I say this, man, and I say it with a chuckle in my gut, but you alluded to something just then. It's not about just simply being compelled to go and look up this or look up that and do additional study. That the preacher is made to do his or her work. Now, we all glean from one another, but this is not the time to preach what you heard somebody else preach.
Absolutely.
Because
Absolutely
everyone out there have access or greater access to what is being said now. And therefore, I think we are being made during this time to really labor, in this. I know that you love preaching. I know that you are a preacher par excellence. I know that you care about preaching. I know that you help shape many of our seminarians here as you serve as an adjunct here. But I say that to all of us to remind us that this time is perhaps refining and even redefining our voices as preachers.
Wow.
And I don't want to take that for granted. I also say that I don't know who's all out there listening, and perhaps I would imagine that you would give me and offer me such liberty to say this, as much as Virginia Union School of Theology is a part of your theological development and shaping. It's home in many ways to you. It's home to me. Humbled to serve in this capacity, and I know Dr. Martin is on, and we would like for anyone who's so interested in furthering their theological development to at least reach out and give us a call, chat with us, call me directly here at the School of Theology, or Dr. Martin, Deborah Martin, our assistant dean, who's doing a wonderful job. Because guess what, y'all? We were prepping ourselves prior to this current social distancing and move to a virtual platform. We were prepping ourselves to come this fall, have a total MDiv degree offering done virtually. And we choose virtual learning as opposed to online learning because it's not self-directed. We anticipate the professors engaging students from beginning to end. So you're going to hear more about that for those who are at a greater distance, can now make their way down a path to earn their MDiv from a distance or virtually. So a whole lot more will be coming out. This week, as a matter of fact, we're going to be pushing it this week about that opportunity. I have a question here, Doc.
Please, go ahead.
There's a question here from Mosby. Is that Leanne Mosby? How does one as a preacher encourage yourself to preach when your congregation is dying off and dwindling? Seniors in a very small congregation. Thanks for that question. And I would say that we are sensitive to such a question and therefore the reality behind it, because it's quite prevalent. And I dare say that a preacher ought to consider encouraging him or herself by receiving and availing oneself to the encouragement of a preaching partner. We're not in this alone. Seemingly convention life is dying off, but many states have still, whatever your denominational affiliation, convention life. We have minister conferences surrounding certain vicinities, but we have such platforms as Seminary on Sundays, and we have those among us that I dare say that we ought to choose to avail ourselves to one another, to encourage one another when we find ourselves doing long or prolonged seasons preaching in the midst of the valley. But with that being said, I do believe that we still have the potential of being heard, or in fact, right now, we are being heard by more than those who are seated in the pew from Sunday to Sunday. Keep preaching life, keep preaching to the context that is before you, but be mindful that if you are streaming and so forth, that others are still hearing and receiving what you are offering, but certainly take advantage of a brother or a sister to lift you and encourage you.
All right. Any other questions? Any other questions? All right. I've got a couple of people who are reaching out saying that they're interested in the seminary.
All right.
So, yeah. So I'm going to make sure that we send them.
Here's what I'm gonna do too. Can I put my email, and Deborah,
Please.
you put your email?
Please. And while you're doing that, I want to, today is Dr. Kimberly Credit's 4th pastor's anniversary. Is it today? Ended today? Yeah, it's today. Yeah. And so first of all, we want to celebrate her in the midst of this pandemic. She had to preach it herself. But here's the other reason why I'm mentioning her. She is herself a notable preacher and teacher of preachers. She is a homiletician. And she's been on every week. She's been on every week since she taught. Dr. Jerry Carter was just on. These are people who are teaching preaching and are considered incredible preachers, and they're getting on every week because they are attempting to stay fresh and stay inspired and stay motivated. I want to say this to every one of you. The biggest reason I'm doing this is I'm not the best preacher I can be yet. I'm not even close. I haven't even scratched the surface. I've got so much more to work on and so much more to do and be in terms of a preacher. To listen to Greg Howard, Jerry Carter, and Kim Credit talk about preaching makes me want to go work on it. I want to challenge you to hang in. Next week, we already have the flyer. We have Dr. Frank Thomas. He is the dean of teaching preachers how to preach. He's the dean in many regards for us. He will be with us next week. He has the only PhD program in Black preaching in the country. The only one. You cannot go wrong. And then following him would be Bishop Rudolph McKissick, who's going to talk on Mother's Day about finding your voice. And then we're going to be blessed with Dr. Gina Stewart, who's going to help us understand How do you maintain, strengthen your voice? And then I believe that we have Dr. William Curtis. I think that we now so we're gonna finish this strong, and we're gonna get through May, and we'll see what happens. But I want to thank Dr. Howard. Please Cash App him something. Say thank you for this amazing presentation. And for all of you who were on today, get on earlier because we're starting to max out at 100. And I'm not extending it past 100 because I think we need to make this valuable and not water it down. So get on, and you can replay this on the podium. Show people where they can hear this again. You need to go back and listen to all of these because this is such rich information. But you can hear this again, and I think you go to Kingdom Fellowship International a Facebook page, and you can hear it. And eventually it will be on YouTube as well. It will be on YouTube as well. All right. So again, thank you all so very much. Have a great day. Some of us are getting ready to go back to work because we got to preach all week and do all this stuff. So or on my page as well. You can get it on my page, John E. Guns. You can get it on my page. Again, if you're interested in Virginia Union Seminary, please reach out to Dr. Howard, or you can call the school, and I believe the number was in this as well. All right, everybody, be blessed, be safe. Greg Howard, man, you're my dude. Thank you so much. All right, y'all. Next week. Be blessed.
Thanks, bro.